This is the editorial board at the Daily Item. We're here with Marc Friedenberg, a Democratic candidate for the 12th Congressional District, the redrawn 12th Congressional District, and that's sort of where I want to start with political newcomer in a redrawn district going up against a four-term congressman in even redrawn is probably still a pretty red district. So you took a big swing the first time out. Just talk about, why you're in it and sort of what you hope to accomplish this time.
Yeah, you say newcomer, and I guess that is fair to say. I've been at this for over a year now, in the sort of the old district and now the new. And I think the great thing about redistricting, well, there's two. I think for the Commonwealth as a whole, I think the lines are much more fair. When the House voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act and to slash Medicaid with no alternative in place, and then celebrated that with a beer bash on the White House lawn, I think for me that was a breaking point. That was a sign that they, and Tom Marino in particular, were willing to vote to support something that, if this were a wealthy district and we would be getting huge tax cuts, I would, on a limited basis, to say, well, you're representing that group of people, and so maybe you vote for it. That might make sense. That is not this district. This is a working class, poor, old, sick, and not very wealthy district. And it did absolutely nothing. Luckily, the Senate didn't pass it, but it would have done nothing for the people of this district. I mean, we have, I think, an obligation to go in the complete other direction and to expand the health care that we're providing, not to slash it. It is holding people back. We have a third of the adults in this district that have medical debt in collection right now. It is the number one issue that I hear from voters about, and I think it presents the clearest contrast between where I would like to take this district and where I believe Congressman Marino would like to take it, although I haven't been able to get a good sense of what he's running on in 2018.
Rick, I know you.
Well, no, let's continue with the talking about healthcare. I believe you're for single payer, as I recall.
Yeah, single payer, Medicare for all being the variant of a single payer system. Yeah.
Yeah. The problem is, let's just presuppose that the House flips and you're in Congress. You have a president who is basically eviscerating Obamacare through executive order. What can you do to move towards what you want to accomplish?
I take the president at his word when he said in the campaign that he wanted better, cheaper health care for everybody. And I think that's what voters in this district wanted overwhelmingly. I think, if you look at Pennsylvania, going from voting for President Obama to then President Trump, I think health care was front of mind for many of them. And I think that whether it's the Paul Ryan agenda, the Mitch McConnell agenda, whatever it was, what the president has supported in office is very different from what he was campaigning on. And I think that, the voters are still feeling left behind. And I think that if we show at the polls in November that voters are still looking for change, I think there is an opportunity to get things done in the next Congress. And you're right, you talk about chipping away at it by executive order. There's also this lawsuit now to try to take away to essentially declare unconstitutional the individual mandate protections that that the overall scheme should topple if one part does. And again, I think that is that's coming from the state level, but it's a Republican effort clearly. And I think again that's just exactly right, a way to undercut, to slash these programs that, while not perfect, have really done a lot of good for people in this district, for the vast majority of Americans, a lot more good than harm. And it is really, it's disappointing to see people, when they voted, they took a chance on change. This is not the change that they wanted.
Can you be a little bit more specific with the Medicare for All, sort of what your plan for it would be, how you pay for it, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Pardon me. So Medicare for All is a single payer plan, as you talked about, and what that means is that the government is the single payer. That's who that refers to. And in the same way that we have Medicare now for older Americans, we expand the program. And what's great about that is that Medicare now covering older Americans is sort of, by definition, covering the sickest risk pool. On an average basis, person who is older is going to be a little bit sicker than the person who is younger. And so when we expand and reduce the age of the Medicare pool average, it's lower risk, but we're still going to be generating the revenues. Now that will be through tax, but what we can do is we can compare what are we paying for healthcare overall now, because it's coming from you one way or another, to what would we be paying under a Medicare for All plan. So, the best data that we have now is that the average American family is paying $6,200 a year in premiums and deductibles for healthcare. And that is a serious burden, as I alluded to. A third of Americans have medical debt that's in collection now. We can, by taxing, and primarily taxing the wealthiest 5% of Americans, spread the risk out, take out the 31% of administrative overhead and profit that the for-profit insurance industry that we rely upon now, and even that the ACA really helped to lock into place. Take that away, reduce the costs down, and increase bargaining power on prescription drug prices. So the Medicare Right Now program has about a 3% overhead, again, compared to 31% for the private insurance industry. And the VA, for example, because it's the single payer for the prescription drugs for its patients, they get a 40% price reduction compared to the average private prescription drug program. And by vastly expanding the size of Medicare as the buyer, we're able to, again, dramatically reduce costs. And some estimates are that it might be, again, 40% or maybe even more. But more importantly than that, it's a moral issue for me. I mean, we have an obligation. We're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And we need to not just really join the rest of the developed world in guaranteeing health care for everybody. And the ACA was trying to do that. But really to go beyond that. I mean, we ought to be having best-in-class healthcare here. I mean, we're certainly paying more per capita than other countries are, and that money is, we're at the top in what we pay, but we're at the bottom in terms of the percentage that actually goes directly to medical providers, because of all the waste and inefficiency that's built in. And we need to expand it to include not just what you would think of as medical care, emergency services, but preventive services, dental, vision, reproductive health, mental health. These would all be protected. There's some proposals that have been offered. Senator Sanders had one in 2017 that's pretty appealing and has been studied pretty widely. And that is one that I would support.
While we're on the topic of healthcare, I just want to hit on the opioid crisis. Obviously, it's everywhere. And the 12th district is not immune to it. Can you talk about some plans you have? I know you want to sort of get rural healthcare, making sure they get some additional services there. Just some plans you have from Washington that can combat the opioid problem in the 12th.
Yeah, I'll start with kind of a little bit broad answer, but I will answer it. For healthcare, there's the sort of the cost component, and I think Medicare for All is a solution to that. A second component is, do we have the providers? And in large parts of rural America, it's hard to get doctors, it's hard to get mental health professionals, it's hard to get dentists to come to rural areas. And that is a problem that is the best predictor of where people are going to set up their medical practices is where they were born. Overwhelmingly, people are going to want to come back to either where they grew up or an area that's pretty similar to where they grew up. And so I think by investing and incentivizing in the local population to go and get advanced education and medical training, that's the best way to do it. There are programs that encourage people to go to rural areas for a number of years, but that's a fix only for a certain number of years.
That's a challenge in the 12th, because you get north of Williamsport, you get north of State College, there is not much up there.
It's a huge challenge, and you're looking at hours drives in some cases to get to the nearest hospital. And if it's any kind of emergency, or I think the Washington Post did a report recently about, or may have been the Times, but about labor and delivery and how hard it can be to get to those providers. And a second piece of that, and this is the third component, is the transportation issue. And for many people, either they can't afford their own car, or for whatever reason they're not able to transport themselves. Not a lot of public transportation, especially in the northern tier, and so getting to those providers becomes that much harder. So, what are some options there? And again, I'll tie this back to opioids, but I think, telemedicine is one option. It's not a panacea, and there are certain types of, even diagnoses that you can't engage in over the internet. But it's a start. It's good. It makes it easier for people to get and keep appointments. We don't have broadband throughout the district. Maybe we'll talk about that more. But I think that is a good use of it if we did. For the opioid crisis in particular, I think we need to overturn Marino's law, what he did to stop the DEA from intercepting and interceding suspicious opioid shipments. I think that's where we got to start. Certainly investing in mental health treatment. And the Senate actually just passed the House bill. I assume the president will sign it. Some opioid, sort of a suite of opioid treatment measures that do make sense to me. Making it providing additional funding for research into non-opioid painkillers, for example. I think that's a good step forward.
Was that the bill yesterday that was?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
It is, okay.
Yeah, and so those sorts of efforts, I support. But unfortunately, I can't give one clear answer because there's so many components to it. There's an economic basis for how is it that the sort of desperation drives people to addiction. Again, there's a genetic component to who becomes addicted and who doesn't, and there is some new research that's being done to be able to, based on a genetic screening, make predictions about whether opioids are going to be habit forming or not for somebody. And so I think that's positive, and I support funding that research even more, and making sure that we have an approach that is based more on compassion rather than the stigma or the criminalization that tends to be our first approach. And so at the local level, you see a number of sort of drug courts or treatment courts and programs springing up, and I think those have shown great results in being able to have people reintegrated into society in a way that saves us money, in the criminal justice system, that makes them be productive members of society. And of course, it's the moral thing to do, that we want to make sure that they get great treatment.
You talked about Tom Marino and the bill that he sponsored down in Washington. We've had him in here. He's been fiercely defensive of how he handled that and the picture people have painted him in with that regard. What was your reaction to the piece, and what have you heard from voters in the 12th about his response to that and what he did leading into that vote?
When the Post and 60 Minutes piece came out, my campaign put out a statement about it, even when I wasn't running against Tom Marino, when I was running against Glenn Thompson, because I think it is a textbook example of the kinds of corruption that you see, where if the pharmaceutical industry is giving you checks for $100,000, it's going to result in changes to the kinds of laws that you push through. Now, in this particular case, it was written by a lobbyist, and so I think that's particularly egregious. Congressman Marino, in his response, I think he's called it fake news. I haven't really seen a meaningful response to it, and so I would look forward to hearing that. But the reporter, the documentary trail is clear, and when I talk to voters about it, I mean it's one of the top issues that they're familiar with. They know that there has been. Oh, I remember about the opioid. I remember part 3 of mine. We need to sue them. That we need to have there needs to be an accounting for what Congressman Marino has done. There's not much that he has done, but this is one thing, and he needs to be held accountable for it. If I could double back on the opioids thing. So we look at what are we going to do about the current crisis, what are we going to do for the future, and what can we do looking back. So I think for the current crisis, the treatment courts, that sort of thing is great. For the future, doing the research into alternative, pain relief medications is really, really important. But then looking back, I mean, we have companies like Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family that lied baldly about what the habit-forming impacts of their medications were going to be. They lied to doctors, and that led them to overprescribe, I think it's fair to say. They need to be held responsible for that, and so I support the private actions that have been brought, the state attorneys general actions that have been brought, and I think it's something that it's not something I would vote on, but I think the Justice Department should take a close look at that as well.
Rick, anything else on opioids?
No, I think we've covered that subject.
Dennis, you have anything on opioids?
No, but what I do want to say, two things on the Marino drug bill. It was passed unanimously by both houses, and the President of the United States, Barack Obama at the time, did sign it.
Roll call vote, yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, there's any number of people that could have raised their hands at any given moment and said, "Hey, wait a minute." So that's part of it that I can understand why Congressman Marino does point that out, because I don't know how many pieces of legislation, probably more than I want to know, gets passed that way. But that was passed in a way that anybody could have disagreed with it and didn't.
You're right, and so you're right that the way that these bills get passed, where there's not really a voting record on it for people, that is troubling, and again, it's a failure of the accountability that voters would like ideally to see. But where you see the efforts to change the DEA's outlook with regard to the bill and to manipulate the way that they thought about it and to silence the whistleblower that was sort of central to that 60 Minutes piece. Mm-hmm. I think that's where the corruption happens, that if the DEA offers an opinion about the bill, you would hope that it's based only on truly held or sincerely held belief about effectiveness to fight crime and abuse, and it appears that it wasn't in this case.
Yeah. Okay. Have we talked about jobs?
Not yet.
Let's talk about jobs. I've read on your site that you're in favor of a $15 an hour minimum wage. Tell me a little bit about what's behind that thought.
Yeah, so all of the states around Pennsylvania have raised the minimum wage above the federal floor. So only on a selfish basis of, what should Pennsylvania be doing, I think Pennsylvania ought to be raising the minimum wage, because we've got the northern tier here, the parts that border New York. Most people leave Bradford County and they go up to New York to work if they're at a minimum wage job, and the minimum wage also raises everybody else's wages as well as a competitive effect. So we're just losing out on tax revenues right there. It is, I think, a fundamental deal that we have between among our society, that if you put in a fair day's work, you should get a fair day's pay. And there is nowhere in the country now that you can afford the average rent based on 40 hours a week at the minimum wage. The minimum wage just clearly has not kept pace with inflation. $15 an hour really doesn't keep pace with inflation from the 70s either, but it gets us closer. And that's really, the number is important, and I think 15 it's where it needs to be.
Would you see it going up immediately, or would you do it in a graduated way?
I think it should be done in a graduated way, and there are exceptions that could be made for small business owners and so forth, but the much larger picture for me is that we have way too many working Americans who are not able to get by. And at the same time, you have corporate welfare that is propping up the very companies that are paying out these minimum wages, padding their profits, and again, workers struggling, relying on government assistance programs, going into bankruptcy, and it's a breakdown of our system.
What do you say to the argument, though? I mean, a lot of businesses around here, hospitals, I guess grocery stores, any number of other businesses around here will raise it on their own. They will pay more than the minimum wage. In fact, they have to if they want to get and keep decent people working for them. So how important is the actual minimum wage itself in an environment where it seems like
it doesn't operate clearly enough or cleanly enough to the theoretical model? It's hard for people to move around, especially in northern and central Pennsylvania. It's not a perfectly fluid economy, in other words. And so that's simply wage. You see the movement of the workers, like people going to New York or to the south to go to Maryland and so forth. And there's a reason that those states have chosen to increase their minimum wage. It's the very reason, if I was running for a job in Harrisburg, I would support an increase to the minimum wage. But the logic applies federally as well, raising the floor from $7 to $7.25, which is currently the Pennsylvania floor as well, the minimum wage. It's outrageous.
So do you think the minimum wage ought to be a federal requirement and not a state requirement?
Well, I'm supporting keeping the same framework now, where the federal minimum wage presents the floor, but that it could be raised. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right, gentlemen.
Sort of stay on jobs. What industries do you think? I know you're an IT guy out in State College. What industries do you think you would be able to draw to the 12th to sort of create some of these jobs that you're talking about that are going to be above and beyond these $15 an hour jobs you're talking about?
It's really hard for me to try to predict exactly what industries are going to be around, in the future. The economy moves too quickly. So I step back and I ask myself, what are the industries that it seems that we've always had, and thus we can infer maybe that we will have for a long time. And healthcare and education are at the top of that list. I think we're going to have an economy that is greatly that centers around healthcare and centers around education, and we happen to be in a really great place for that in this district. Those are things that we do have. So we have great universities, and we have great healthcare systems and great providers, and so I think that's a strong foundation. The other thing I think that is a resource for this district is the environment and the outdoors and ecotourism, and this ties into what I see as the subtext of what I hear from voters throughout this campaign. They don't always say it this way, but especially when I talk to older voters, it's a sense of brain drain, or that their children and grandchildren are leaving Pennsylvania, and they're leaving because they can't get jobs here. And so what I see is, if we can make an economy that works for younger Americans, younger Pennsylvanians, who are going to want to stay here because they can go hiking and kayaking, whatever they want to do at night or on the weekends, and they can work a job in healthcare and education. If we can get broadband throughout the district, they could work remotely for whatever industry it's going to be. Surely the internet will be involved. I think that is a really strong basis, because then you've got access to those outdoor activities, affordable housing, relatively low taxes, and that tends to be the kind of thing that creates the foundation or the nucleus for a new generation of industry to develop, whatever it may be. I could make predictions, but I think I don't even need to. That the role for Congress ought to be to provide that infrastructure.
You talked about infrastructure. You've talked a bunch of times about broadband already. Really rural district in the 12th. Now, we're sort of not as rural as some of it is in the 12th, but broadband is a significant issue here in the Susquehanna Valley. As an IT guy, does this need to be a federal prerogative to wire everybody?
It does, and it's a market failure, broadband right now. So for lots of rural areas, it's never going to be economically advantageous for Comcast to wire up your home, and even if it is, they're the only choice you've got, and so you'll pay whatever they tell you to pay, and that's a market failure. And so in the same way that you have choice in electricity, theoretically in phone for those who still have it, and a number of other areas, that once we have this natural monopoly, we have the cable running your house, only makes sense to run it once. We ought to have a program that requires there to be options, that you have competition or a choice for who your provider is going to be. That's for the people who are wired up, and maybe they're around Sunbury. For the people who aren't wired up, they're not going to be. It'll never be worth it for Comcast to do it. And so in those cases, in the same way that we had rural electrification in the 30s, we should have the government step in and directly provide for that construction. Running the cable, fiber optic cable, is the best in class, fastest, to every home, to every business. That is absolutely the foundation that we need.
How do you pay for it?
We pay for it in the same way we pay for everything else, which is a series of taxes, right, depending upon who it is. But it's an investment that we need to make. I mean, for individuals who have it run to who pay for it at their homes, they've already made the calculation that it's worth it. And I think the same logic would apply to the government as well. On a per capita basis, it might be more expensive for the more rural areas, but we've decided that they deserve postal service, they deserve electricity, and certainly the logic applies that if you're looking at it in terms of they need access to information, they ought to be wired in to the rest of the world.
What do we do for, we have a lot of we're called one-on-one programs here in our valley where every student has an iPad or a laptop or things like that, but we have kids that don't have the access to the internet when they get home. Is this something schools need to become involved in, or is this a federal punch from the jump?
I mean, I think it's a federal program. There are the problem that you allude to about students and the school. It's a serious problem. There are schools in the northern tier that provided the iPads, I guess like what you're saying, and that they're not able to use them, or that they have to go to the Burger King or something like that to get on the Wi-Fi there. Libraries closed too early. That's another problem. I don't see the schools being able to jumpstart that infrastructure. I do see the federal government being able to do it, though.
Do you see any promise in new technologies? including 5G, some of the new technologies. Do you think there's promise there?
There's some, like wireless technologies, yeah. In theory, yes. I think the way that the market has played out is that, you know, I run into the data cap on my cell phone like the third day of the billing cycle. Like you run into it right away. It's built differently. The metering is done differently for wireless and wired. And I think that the kinds of applications that people are going to want to do, streaming video being one, and then who knows, augmented reality, virtual reality, telemedicine, robotic surgery, who knows what it's going to be in the future. They're going to require massive amounts of bandwidth. And for wireless, you know, there are huge parts of this district. When I drive on I-80 from place to place, I don't get even voice. And so I don't have huge faith in the robustness of those kinds of solutions.
Okay.
At least for this kind of a district. Maybe a flatter one, it could be okay.
Right.
And then one that doesn't flood periodically as well.
Talking about jobs, and this is still to some degree an agricultural community, and as you know, tariffs are been a big part of the news lately, and tariffs are hurting farmers in this district. In fact, even Republican Senator Pat Toomey has been vocal about how tariffs are hurting Pennsylvania farmers. Yesterday, President Trump increases the number of goods that are going to be the victim of tariffs in China. What do you think the House can and should do about these tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly, first, yes, it's still a agricultural economy to a large extent, particularly dairy. And I hear from farmers all the time about the impact of the tariffs, and really, tariffs and broadband are the top two issues that I hear from grange groups and farm bureaus. And which was surprising to me, the tariffs, the $200 billion increase yesterday. You know, I was teaching a class this morning on globalization. I teach at Penn State, and so the tariffs. I see a couple of problems. There's the direct impact, which is that it's a tax, right? That's exactly what a tariff is. Even the way that it's being rolled out, part of it now, 10%, I believe, and starting in about a week, and then it'll jump to 25% after January 1st. It's really a PR move to make sure it doesn't impact people for Christmas. It's an unpopular thing to do, and the effect that it's going to have on farmers and really the rest of us, all of these products that come from China, it's going to be pretty devastating. Although Wilbur Ross, I saw today, I think he made some kind of argument that so many products are going to be covered by a tariff that we won't feel it somehow. That was the argument that he was making. It'll be hidden in the background. Certainly not true. And so, the House has so much power. This is a larger point. The House has significant power, Congress does, to serve as a check on an executive, whether they're from the same party or not, to make sure that they're performing their constitutional role and that they're acting in the best interest of this country. I don't see a lot of people arguing that the tariffs are in the best interest. So even if it's not something where Congress is necessarily going to be empowered to act directly on it, there is a way that you can say, Mr. President, we don't support these tariffs, and we're not going to support other elements of your agenda until you work with us and come back down and start to work with us on the tariff issue. Because the logic of the trade war, which is what we're in now, it's clear, crystal clear, it doesn't end. China will respond, we will respond, and so on. And the president said that trade wars are good and easy to win, and that's wrong. And he is unlikely to stop it himself. It falls to the Congress to act as a check on that runaway logic.
And we obviously felt the impact of tariffs in our industry as well.
Of course, yeah.
And,
of course.
We were pleased to see the International Trade Commission make the decision it made a couple weeks ago. But
I'm sorry. Could I just make one point about the tariffs? The way that it's being there's lobbying that happens, right? And for exemptions from tariffs. And that's good, and for newspapers, that's great. We were studying it in class last week from a perspective of Apple had written to the U.S. Trade Representative to say, this is going to impact our watches and our AirPods and all of these different Apple products, and that would be really bad. And what do you know, this week, yesterday we found out that most of those products are going to be exempted. It's creating winners and losers. I think Scott Wagner has lobbied for some exceptions that benefit him as well. And and that creates an additional warping effect, and that's another reason why these tariffs are extremely problematic.
Yeah. Okay. let's talk about budgets and budget deficits. Forever, if I can remember as a kid, Republicans were the spend within your means party. Democrats were the tax and spend party. That was the prevailing theory out there.
Among some.
But here we are, just piling up deficits like at a probably record pace. So, what needs to be done there, and what could you as a congressman do about that?
Well, yeah, now this is the heart of what a congressman can do. So you're absolutely right that those deficits are increasing at extraordinary rates.
And by the way, nobody seems to care.
Well, yeah, I think you're right, although certainly I do. So a couple points about this. I think where does this perception about what do the parties do or not do? I think nobody really believes that any one party says, oh, money doesn't matter, deficits don't matter. I think that is overly simplistic, and I know you're not saying that, but that there's I think we see again and again that you'll see George W. Bush, for example, increasing spending on some programs, Medicare expansions and some things that maybe are good, increasing the deficit, and then when Democrats are in the majority in Congress, then you hopefully see some things be dialed back, that it's sort of easier to throw over to the next guy to deal with the problems of what's going to come next. I think when you saw this tax tax reform be passed in December, and it added 1.5 to the impact, I think is still not entirely known, but trillions to the deficit. That was either the next guy can deal with it. I'm Paul Ryan, I'm retiring, goodbye. Or we then have the impetus to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now, this is something that Congress certainly has authority over. And I have a campaign app. I won't show it to you now, but part of what it is you get $1.5 trillion, and I list out here are the components of the GOP tax plan. Here are some other more progressive ideas of what we could do. Universal college education. One, you could sort of piece together your plan. What would you do if you were in charge, and pass your own budget. The 1.5 trillion, I would be okay with adding $1.5 trillion to the deficit. I think there is a good case for that, actually. But I would do it in a way that is the complete opposite of the way that this Congress did it. The way that this Congress did it is to give massive tax cuts to corporations, its donors, and to the wealthiest Americans, and smaller temporary cuts to the rest of us. We could have given, I think it was $3,000, just $3,000 check to every American with that amount of money. That would be a pretty stimulative use of that money. I would be okay with that. We might be able to get a return on investment of that, or at least it would help people pay their bills, and we'll get through. Because we just had the 10-year anniversary of the financial crisis. That was something that I worked through as a lawyer, suing the Wall Street banks that caused that crisis, which led to a broader economic decline. And the recovery certainly has been uneven. I mean, that's I think the story of the past 10 years, and it's influenced politics and culture and everything else. And one of the ways that we can help to even it out is to give people more money, and either in the form of a tax cut, in a rebate, or directly, as George W. Bush did, also as a check. And that would have been an okay use of it. We have the longer term deficit concerns, getting into the tens of trillions, over 20 trillion. Those are serious problems. But if they're being spent on investment, if they're being spent in a way that is going to return the dollar to us, I think investing in broadband is a good use of that. I actually think that investing in healthcare is a good use of it. One of the things I didn't say earlier is that right now for healthcare, so many people feel tied to their jobs because of their health insurance situation, and that if they get sick, they'll often lose their job and then their health care too. And so it's holding people in place, it's keeping people in jobs that may not be the best use of their time and talents, and it's really solidifying or maybe that's not the right word, but it is calcifying the economy. It's keeping people in places that aren't necessarily the best for them. So investment, education, infrastructure, those are the kinds of things where I would support increase.
Explain to me and to the people who will be watching this subsequently on our website, your statement that you are okay with adding $1.5 trillion to the deficit. Why is that an okay thing to do?
Well, because the U.S. runs deficit. It's done it for a long time, and it it's one of the consequences of being able to print your own money and be the world's reserve currency. We can have deficits. That is okay. In the same way that people take out, I'm mixing a little bit here, debts and deficits, but they're interrelated. In the same way that you would have a mortgage for your home, you view that as an investment, that you would take that on, or that you might, for a short period of time, take on some additional debts, run a deficit in support of increasing capital in some way, making some investment. So I think that is okay. And as I said, if it was being spent in the right way, it's a lot of money, but this is a big country. If it was being spent in the right way, it would be okay. I think the way that the GOP tax cut was being spent, we've known at least since the 80s, is not the right way. Trickle down does not work, and we've seen evidence now in the year since that. It was overwhelmingly that $1.5 trillion. If you follow where it went to stock buybacks. It was going through corporations back out to the wealthiest Americans. We don't see the increase in wages. We haven't seen a broad economic recovery. It's really been among the upper few percentage of Americans in terms of income.
We hear from people here, though, and granted, this is an area that went solidly for the president in the election. We hear from people that, hey, I've got more money in my pocket. The tax cut increased my take-home pay, and so they're pretty positive about that. And they see that the unemployment rate is at a low for many years, 10 years, whatever it is. So
I think it might be 2000.
It might be. So, I mean, how do you talk to people who are considering yourself versus Mr. Marino? But wait a minute, these Republicans, they put more money in my pocket and the unemployment is down. What's wrong with that?
I think the best way to think about it is and that's great. I will not begrudge anybody having more money in their pocket, having a low unemployment rate, all good things. But what could have been? You might have a little bit more extra money in your pocket from a tax cut that is going to go away. But you could have had either a more permanent cut or you could have had a much bigger cut. And you could have had a cut that would have stimulated the creation of additional jobs. You would have had a cut that would have been bigger and longer lasting. And we have by giving away those temporary cuts to some workers, again, that's great. But I think that workers in this district and folks who aren't working too are suffering so badly that a little bit extra, that's not enough. I mean, we're in a crisis in a lot of different ways in this district and really in the country as a whole. And a couple of $100 extra, absolutely great. And I know that makes a big difference for a lot of people. But the kinds of to bring back the economy that really was working for everybody, the post-war boom type of economy, it's going to require a much more broad-based, much larger, more sustained economic boom.
Okay. Bill?
Mark, you just said we're in a crisis. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, I think that the economy is broken for so many people that they're working really, really hard. They're working more jobs. They have, in a lot of towns in this district, there's one or two employers really. There's not much competition even where they can move and get a raise. People are environmental impact alone. Climate change is having a huge impact on this district. Homes are getting destroyed, roads are getting destroyed, flooding is causing massive devastation. We have a unresponsive government in many respects, and I think that if say Congressman Marino were really proud of the job that he's been doing, he would be very eager to have a debate or a forum of some kind with me and to have the kind of discussion that we're having now, and he seems unwilling to do that. But this crisis, people are suffering, and it's, as I've learned throughout the campaign, it takes a lot of work and I guess as reporters you would know this too, it takes some work to find them, because they're not always the loudest one. They're working really hard, and they're humble. This district is really filled with really smart, hardworking people, resourceful, but the deck has been stacked against them for so long that first they don't have the ability to climb back up. And for a lot of them, I think it's almost hard to imagine a much better economy. In other words, they might be losing hope. And I think that's the biggest concern of all. I think people of this district deserve not a little bit more, but a lot more for all the work that they're doing, for being born in America in the 20th or living in the 21st century. we ought to be doing so much more for them on education, on healthcare, making sure they have breathable air and drinkable water. And we've left them behind in so many ways. That's the crisis that I'm talking about.
Let's talk about a few things that are breaking in the news right now. Just do a few quick things. One is not DACA, but the child camps. We don't even know at this point how many kids are in child camps. As a congressman, what can you do about that? It seems to outrage people, and yet sometimes it falls on page 3 now of the news. There's so many other things going on. But.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to say. I can't remember now if I saw that there were 20,000 or that they're building a capacity for 20,000 children. And what can Congress do? Congress has the power of the purse and it has the ability to conduct investigations and to hold the executive and administrative agencies responsible. And that's I think the main area where this Congress has failed, where where the president and the executive branch are doing good things. Support them, sure. Still provide the oversight, make sure there's not waste, make sure that there aren't abuses. I think the family separation policy clearly is an abuse. It's a choice that was made. It's not something that's required by law. It's immoral. It's an outrage. And where the president, isn't working in the best interest of the people, to stop, because we have the ability as Congress. If I was in Congress, we would have the ability to defund, to control the budget and to defund programs, to have a really significant say. The founders, when they wrote the Constitution, envisioned that Congress would be the most powerful branch. There's no doubt about that. It's the first one. And over a long time now, the president has become more, and we have this, people talk about the imperial presidency. And the president, because it's the one national sort of elected figure, gets all the attention. Everybody gets riled up. They love or hate President Obama. They love or hate President Trump. But as you say, the impact can be lower or at a lower level. On page 4, the Congress needs to reassert its authority to be the most direct representative of the people. And I think that is something where some elected officials today are afraid to buck the leadership of the party, and that's what leads to somebody who represents, say, the 12th District of Pennsylvania, voting at every turn for something that would benefit, a wealthy Manhattanite, but not benefit somebody in this district.
President Trump has said to people in national ads, vote Republican because they're going to impeach me if the House and Senate turn Democrat. Should the president be impeached? If so, why? If not, why?
I think that the investigations that it looks like a Republican Congress won't do and that a Democratic Congress will, they're important, and it's for abuses that may have happened during the campaign. It's for abuses that have happened since. I'm deeply troubled by the way that the president is personally is increasing his personal wealth through things like the Trump International Hotel and foreign lobbying and so forth. But I do think that from what we've seen from Robert Mueller's investigation, the indictments, and the plea bargain, the guilty pleas since, I think we've seen pretty clear evidence that there was a conspiracy to hack emails and receive communications from Hillary Clinton, from the DNC, from John Podesta, and to distribute them in a way that was maximally harmful, like during the Democratic National Convention. And I think that there's more that we're going to learn about that. And so, I'm a lawyer, I'm a supporter of law and order, and I support the Department of Justice and its work in using traditional law enforcement techniques, like using cooperating witnesses, to conduct that investigation. And I think it's moving along pretty quickly. And the best part is, well, maybe not the best part, but one really nice side effect, the investigation just paid for itself last week with Paul Manafort's plea bargain and the civil forfeiture. I think it was about $17 million going into DOJ coffers. I think it's twice already what the investigation has cost. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is, that investigation should continue. And then there are a number of other kinds of investigations that I think we'll see from the House about violations of the Emoluments Clause, that sort of personal enrichment from foreign nations. I think that's one area. I think you brought up the child separation policy. I think we still haven't gotten a clear accounting of ultimately who was responsible for that and who should be held responsible for it, and a number of other investigations. That's what Congress ought to be doing.
Does that all add up to impeachment?
Yeah, so it's a political question, and I guess I'm running for political office, so you're asking me. Honestly, I can't say because I haven't seen all of the evidence, but it's not absurd. I think that we need to have. Yesterday, I believe it was, the president ordered the declassification of documents relevant to an ongoing investigation involving him. That's deeply troubling. That is deeply troubling. And nobody, not only is the Republican Congress not saying, hey, don't do that, it seems like Dim Nunes and others were the ones who have been encouraging him to do it. And that's a breakdown in our constitutional order. And that doesn't benefit anybody. And so it is, it's certainly within reason to imagine that, I don't know about the ultimate act of impeachment, but investigations that are going to reveal exactly what's been happening, that is important.
Okay. We've only got a few more minutes to go here. I do want to ask a couple other quick questions, and I'm sure some of our other colleagues here do as well. It's been months since the shooting in Parkland, Florida. Nothing substantive has happened in Washington. Now it seems to have fallen off their radar. You've been supported by the moms demanding action. What can we do to get this issue back on the front burner and get something done, or is there something specific that you would suggest ought to be done?
Well, unfortunately, I think we all know what's going to get it back on the front burner, and nobody wants it to happen, but it will happen again before too long, referring to another mass shooting event. I think what we need to do is clear. I think that the common sense gun safety measures, like the kinds that Moms Demand Action support, universal background checks being one, raising the minimum wage to 21, those are things that we ought to be doing. This is at the state level, not the federal level, but there is a bill to make sure that convicted domestic abusers get hand in their weapons earlier, I think within 24 hours rather than the current 2 weeks. That's a common sense gun safety measure. We're not saying the vast majority of law-abiding, safe, responsible gun owners, it will have no impact on their use, enjoyment for hunting and so forth of their weapons. We're looking to stop that tiny minority and keeping people safe.
Do you think, the way we're structured right now, I can be driving through Pennsylvania and be perfectly legal, and I can drive into New York and be completely against the law? And there's been some kind of conversation about having a kind of a universal gun law. Would you support something like that?
I would not. So I think the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution has been interpreted to provide an individual right to bear arms, subject to, as Justice Scalia wrote, some safety regulations for purposes of safety. The Pennsylvania Constitution, on the other hand, actually says an individual right to bear arms. So the Pennsylvania Constitution goes further in providing protections than the U.S. Constitution does. So I think that it actually makes sense to leave it to the states to set their own measures consistent with their constitutions, their elected, their.
So it's just up to the gun owner to be aware of the laws of the state they happen to be driving into.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Gentlemen, anything else? Obviously, and I'm sure this question is sort of the elephant in the room. You're running in a albeit new but still very red district. I guess I'm curious your thought process in diving into it and your anticipation of what your chances of success.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you why I'm going to win. Really, you say it's a red district, and in one sense, that's true. But another color, it's sort of the clear part, is the people who aren't voting. That's the majority. Majority of people who aren't voting, even in presidential years. And so what we're doing throughout the campaign is reaching out to the people who haven't been voting. And another part is that it's not really red or blue. I like to think of it as it's the haves and have-nots. That's the big dividing line here that I see. That's why you can have Pennsylvania going for a President Obama and then a President Trump looking for, and of course individual voters making that change, that there are people who are just looking for will the government provide some help, right? What can the government do to help level this playing field for me so that I have a chance to succeed? I'm really proud of the platform that I'm running on and how it will help to do that, how it will help to level that playing field. That's what people, I think, are looking for. They're looking for progress in the meaningful kitchen table or pocketbook issues. How are you going to get more money in my pocket, get my kids a better education, make sure I get access to better health care? Those are the things that people want to talk about, not all the things that divide us in the normal red-blue way, not talking about who's kneeling and who's not, at a football game, not dividing us up based on who do you follow on Twitter or which TV channel do you watch for your news, but what can you do to really raise my quality of life and make this an America that works again for me, and that's what I promise to deliver.